Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Culture Talks. We are Heather and Shaila, the regional managers of Crown's Global Skills team. I'm Heather, I'm based in the UK and I oversee programmes in the EMEA and the Americas region.
Hello, I'm Shaila, I'm based in Hong Kong and I oversee programmes in Asia Pacific.
Each episode of Culture Talks, we want to pull back the curtain of cultural training, bust some myths and do this with our own stories and examples on different topics each episode. We want to showcase the impact and the scope of cultural training.
So last episode of Culture Talks, we looked at culture in the workplace and how culture impacts so many aspects. This episode, we're looking at culture and language and busting the myth that language training and cultural training are completely independent and unrelated to each other. And today we're going to do things a bit differently because we have no guest, but we have had lots of input. So a big thank you to our team and everyone else who gave us so much insight for today's podcast. And Heather, we have you. You started your career in language training.
Yeah.
You can share what you're really excited to talk about language and culture today.
So yes, I started my career as an English teacher, and I also want to acknowledge that it's not just me that is excited about this topic. I've had so much input from former colleagues who've also been very excited by what we're talking about. So on many levels, language training is really quite straightforward. You know, you teach sentence structure, vocabulary, pronunciation, and yet there's so much culture at play. You know, as a teacher, when you're preparing a lesson on small talk, which is something that you start with beginners and you're still teaching at advanced levels, you will get students asking you for correct question forms on topics that actually are probably considered really personal and inappropriate for small talk in certain cultures, you know, things like money or politics. So really, you know, culture really has to be addressed. And when you think about language training and cultural training, you know, they both create an understanding of culture, but they have two completely different objectives, so they can't be completely interchangeable.
So what do you mean by different objectives?
So culture training, really the objective of that is to understand what impacts the behavior, you know, what makes people tick, creating like a deeper awareness and maybe some strategies about what to do with that awareness. Language training, the objective is to really ensure that students are effectively using language. And to do that, you've got to achieve two parts. So firstly, students need to be able to use the correct linguistic forms, but then culturally appropriate language as well. So, for example, I was a professional skills trainer in Malaysia and I was teaching business email writing skills. So in business, you have to get the message across, you know, to get the business done. So you're teaching like correct sentence structures, grammatical forms, appropriate greetings and sign-offs. And it's there where most of that culture really comes in. You know, in Malaysia, Malaysian English is a widely used language, and a standard sign-off in Malaysia is kindly do the needful. So that laughter is already starting to tell you, like, you're understanding there's a cultural element there. Like, if you get an email with that sign off, Shaila, how does that land? How does it make you feel?
That makes me feel like it's a little really, I wouldn't know how to respond, you know, like it's a bit jarring. Like, how do I respond? Is it rude? I don't know. It just doesn't sit very well for me.
Right. So you'd be noticing that and you'd be spending time thinking about that. So as a business email, that isn't effective. Right. And as a language trainer, once they'd got the grammar and vocabulary correct, I needed to then refer to culture to ensure my students were really getting their message across effectively. So to consider the culture of their audience in order to use effective linguistic forms.
Right. So, and that's exactly what we're looking at, right, Heather? Language and culture, and why language is really the ultimate window into the culture. So let's start with how language can reflect culture, because language, as you know, can tell you so much about social rules, mindset, and the underlying values.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look at the kind of concept of time in the US, and also really, the UK and Australia as well. We talk about time as a commodity and quite a linear concept that we have control over. It's mine, and
Mm.
I only have so much of it, and I need to then think about wasting it or saving it. So look at the link, like the terms like, do you have 5 minutes? Or can I take 5 minutes of your time?
Mm.
I mean, the very US one of let me give you back 10 minutes and end
Mm.
this meeting early. That's all about us controlling it. And yet, you go to somewhere like Egypt. And when I was teaching in Egypt, you'd say to your students, like, all right, see you next lesson. And they would all say, Inshallah, which means like God willing. So
Mm.
there's a very different idea around concept of time and how much control you have over that, and that really shows up in the language.
And so that's the same with formality. Most languages have
Mm-hmm.
different levels of formality, but how
Mm.
many levels can reflect the formality of that culture? So in
Mm.
English, we use pleasure to meet you or versus all right, mate. You know, it's appropriate according to the culture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like other languages, you've got whole linguistic forms. Like French, you've got vous and tu to show formality.
And in Hindi, we use up and thum, and the hierarchy shows in the Japanese language with various forms of honorifics.
Right, exactly. So actually, when we were preparing this, we even talked about how do you do, didn't we? But then we dismissed it because actually, it's really archaic example of formality. But there again, when we're thinking about culture, why is it archaic? Because the UK culture has changed.
Mm.
All right, mate, is okay now, but 100 years ago would never have been even considered. So
Mm.
language can tell you so much about history and cultural evolution. And, how do you do now is being confined to wearing a corseted dress when you're in Downton Abbey or Bridgerton.
Yeah. So we've covered how language can reflect cultural norms. But what about when culture changes the use of language? And sometimes it confuses the situation.
Absolutely, yeah. And not just even when you're learning another language. When you're learning another language, you might expect to not be understood or to understand completely. But what about even within your own language? Culture can make it really challenging to access the meaning or even appropriacy behind certain words. In Spanish, there are words used in Spain on a daily basis that are considered really vulgar in Latin American Spanish.
Well, let's look at English. It's an international language and our native tongue. And,
Mm,
we can only really speak from our own expertise. Both of us
right.
are British. But if we move to the US or Australia, I wouldn't expect to need to consider language and considering those culture. I mean, English is English.
Right. Yeah, so you wouldn't actually think you need language training, but you would need to have cultural awareness, like linguistic cultural awareness. Um, you know, this was the area that when we were preparing for this, we were given the most examples. This is the most content that we are not allowed to use in this episode. Examples of where words across different cultures really, really differ.
Mm.
So that's for the next like podcast nights. That's what we have. But examples that could give us this kind of insight about how language changes. So in the US, you might be in a meeting, and someone might tell everybody in the meeting they need a full court press. I
Oh,
mean,
I know that one. I've got teenage boys, they play basketball. So that's a phrase in the basketball arena. It means
mm,
all members of the team steps out of position and just runs to the end of the court. It means everyone in the meeting or whatever that's going on needs to get fully involved.
right. Yeah, and so for me, like I understand each individual word, but that just conjures up like white curly wigs of lawyers, or I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe even a journalist or something.
right.
No idea.
So I guess that's also the equivalent to all hands on deck. Very British saying, But
Right.
again, you need to understand the meaning behind the words. And when you're speaking with someone, it's easier. Guess by context, see how
Mm,
others are responding and follow. But
mm,
in writing, it could be even more confusing, right? I mean, earlier we talked about kindly do the needful. If you're reading that, you might guess and interpret meaning. And as I said, it feels awkward. I might feel
mm.
it's there's a I might even make up a meaning that wasn't there. I might feel a bit
Yeah.
confused on that.
Right, right. So then, yeah, we come back to that cultural awareness of language. Who is your audience? And so flip it, it's not just your audience. You've got to be aware of your own cultural norms and how they impact how you use language. So when teaching English, you'd sometimes get pushback when you're correcting students and kind of maybe asking them to add please or use more polite sentence structures. But you'd get pushback from students of certain cultures. Because they would be feeling that the language that they were using was excessively polite and was showing that actually that they were, I don't know, making themselves weak or like begging. So yeah, it's quite straight how culture can really impact how you want to use it.
So we've talked about their audience may expect those.
And I get it too. As an A-level French student, I remember panicking in a boulangerie trying to order croissants. And as my panic increased, my brain started going into like excessive British politeness form. So, oh, excuse me, sir, would it be possible? Like actually saying like, est-ce que c'est possible pour... rather than just really simple, like je voudrais, like I would like, it's correct language, but it was just culturally weird. I was using it.
I know I do the same thing when I'm trying to speak Hindi. I become very formal because I'm directly translating in my head.
Yeah, totally. And so, yeah, it's just when language and culture crosses, you have to start stepping back a bit. Who's my audience? What will they understand? And it's also really important to acknowledge that there might be right and wrong in linguistic forms, but there isn't in culture. So for when I was teaching my Malaysian students, my job became about highlighting, where the two languages and the two cultures differed. Neither one was right and neither one was wrong.
And that's a really insightful tip to think about. And so this brings us nicely to the end of our podcast today and our myth that language training, cultural training are independent and unrelated. Hopefully we've shown you how intertwined they are and how they complement each other.
They do complicate each other.
But also they're not the same. When you're learning a language, it can be seen as part of survival. If you've just arrived somewhere and you want to get around, but it's also the ultimate window into the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So as ever, let's leave you, our audience, with a question. When you are communicating today, how much are you considering the culture of your audience? And if you did that, how might it change your communication? So Shaila, it's always a joy. Thank you. And thank you so much to our audience for listening. Join us next time for episode 5 of Culture Talks.